Greetings, I'm Vince DiNoto, the designer of this module, which is creating the ArcGIS server, and also the designer of the entire course on using ArcGIS and other GIS tools on the web. So we're going to actually create multiple videos for this section. The reason we're going to make multiple videos, there's like 66 slides in this module, and that video would be much too long for a single sitting. So we're going to try to break this into multiple components. This first component will be about installing the ArcGIS server, and then future components will be about using the ArcGIS server. First, we're going to talk though about some assumptions that we're going to make about what you already have in place and what you need to have in place to be able to make this work. You need to have a server. A server is different than a desktop, so we need to have this server box, which can be either a virtual box, which means it could be out on a shared network drive, and it's actually a large server that they've broken into a small component to be your server, or it could actually be a physical box. You do not have to have that physical box right in front of you. You might remote into that physical box, which is very common in the actual production world, or if you're using a virtual box, you definitely will be remoting into it. So that's the first thing. We're going to assume that you're working in the Windows operating system, and so therefore on the server that we're going to be using, it's going to be a 2012 Release 2 server. It could be a different version of the operating system, and if it's a different version, you'll have slightly different looks. We're going to assume that this operating system for the server has already been configured. This is before we get and worry about the ArcGIS part of it. You need to have a relational database. We're not going to install the relational database. We're going to assume it's already been installed, and we're just going to use the relational database for this part of the course. A relational database gives us the ability to create feature services, and feature services will be able to be edited actually out online. Now there's lots of different relational databases: Oracle, SQL, SQL Express. There's public domain ones, or open source type databases that could be used. We're going to be using in this set of slides an SQL server, a Microsoft SQL server. Having this to be able to connect to is going to be critically important. You also need a place that data can be placed, what we would normally think of as a mass storage array. And we're going to look at it not being cloud-based, but being physically inside your firewall based. So you need this place in which data can be placed. The mass storage array and the SQL server are both needed. SQL server is going to be for things that you want to edit out online, and the mass storage box is going to be more for stuff that you've already created that's only going to be visible by the user outside of your organization. So we actually will make these connections. It's really critical that these should not be part of your server. They should be independent boxes, not part of your server. And the reason we tell you to do that, and that's because if they're part of your server, it's going to slow down the operational speed of your server. They should be independent boxes that are sitting outside of your ArcGIS server. You need to know where the server software is. It may have already been placed as the installation files on your box, or it may be located somewhere else, but you'll need to be able to have a pathway to get to wherever the installation software is for ArcGIS server. You're also going to need to have a license code. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but you're going to have a license code to be able to make the server software run. In setting up the box, you need to have administrative rights to the box, and your instructor also needs to have administrative rights to the box so they can assist you when you have problems. So these are some of the assumptions that we're going to assume have happened before you really get started in this course. Some basic information that you need to know. This ArcGIS server is not a free product. There are open source geospatial servers out there, but the one we're going to use is a commercial product. Therefore, it's not a free product. And it can only be used for educational purposes. You cannot go out and make money using this software that you're going to be using. It can only be used for educational purposes. If you're running a different version than what we're running, again, we're going to run Server 2012 Release 2, and we're going to run ArcGIS Server 10.3. So if you're running a different version, it may look somewhat different than what my screenshots are showing you. Not every screenshot is going to be given to you, and the reason is just to keep this slide deck as short as possible. We say as short as possible, but it's got over 60 slides in this slide deck. But we want to try to keep things simple on what you're seeing, so you need to be able to read what we're saying very carefully and what we've written, because we're going to a lot of times say, just click next on the button that appears. But we're going to just use the default settings. As much as possible, we're going to use default settings in setting up your ArcGIS server. That's the typical way you might initially set one up. As you would gain more experience, then you might change some things, or depending on how your operating system looks, you might change some things. But typically, you start by just using default items to be recorded. So you're going to have to install this server onto your server. You're going to have administrative rights. Again, we don't care if it's a physical box, if it's a dual boot off of a desktop box, or if it's a virtual machine completely. We're just assuming it's not completely out in the cloud, that it is a virtual machine behind your firewall and not out there in the something like the Amazon cloud. That's the assumptions that we're making. We're assuming that you will have an authorization code. Without the authorization code, you cannot do any of the work. You can do all the work of installing, but then you cannot do any of the actual making it work. And that's the whole purpose of this, is to be able to serve out data that then can be consumed by a web map, for example. So you have to log into the server itself. You also will then eventually have to have a login that you'll create for the ArcGIS server. So you have this login to the machine, and then you're going to have a login that you're going to use with the software. So keep those recorded, because if you forget either one of those, it may block you from being able to continue the work in this module. Throughout the module, there's going to be times where there's going to be key screen images taken. And part of the assessment is just that you've worked through the process. You don't have an instructor who's going to be standing over your shoulder watching what you're doing, so therefore you need to prove to your instructor that you've actually worked through the process. So you're going to take screenshots whenever you need to. You can either use a screen capture program that might be built into Windows, or you may use a screen capture program such as Jing. We really don't care what you use as your screen capture program, but when you see the camera icon, make sure you capture that screen. That's going to show your instructor how you're progressing through. Also, it can be good to help troubleshoot what's going on. So if you have a problem with making the server completely work, giving your instructor a screen capture can help your instructor understand better what you're doing. While you're in the installation process of the ArcGIS server, keep all these screen captures in a single folder, name each screen capture appropriately. Then what we want you to do is zip up that or compress all those images into a single folder, a zip folder, and you need to give it some type of descriptive name, such as what I've shown here in green, like images underscore M2 for module 2 underscore and my initials. So therefore your instructor can keep your screen images separate from somebody else's screen images. At the end of the installation process, there is going to be a short quiz or an assessment given to you to make sure that you really understand what you did. So let's get started a little bit here. And we've tried to highlight some things in red and green here that hopefully will help you. We've also put some bold terms in here, again, things that we want to make sure that you understand. So I'm just going to go sort of by bullet with you. IIS, Internet Information Services, must be turned on. We're going to assume that you're working in a Microsoft environment, and therefore if you're working in a Microsoft environment, you need to have IIS turned on. If you're working in some other environment, you might have Apache, but we're going to assume it's an IIS environment, and we're not going to worry about other types of protocols there. This is how you get information out on the web, if you will. You most likely are running a more advanced operating system than .NET Framework 3.5, but it must be turned on to make this work. If you don't have .NET 3.5 turned on, this will not work, so be aware of that. You must turn off Microsoft Enhanced Security. Again, if you have it left on, it's not going to work. Depending on the version of the ArcGIS or the ArcGIS server you're installing, some of this is walked through automatically with you and some of it is not. So it just depends again on the version. These are some of the changes that have occurred over the last few iterations. As I noted before, you must log into the server before you actually start working with the software. So you got to remember there's two separate logins. You may have a domain login that's logging you into the server, and then you're going to have a login just for the ArcGIS server software. Typically, you do not ever sit at the console of a server. Typically, what you're doing is you're remoting into the server, so you don't sit actually at the console of that server. If you're working outside of your firewall, you might have to have a VPN to be able to remote into your server. Again, as we mentioned before, you must have full administrative rights, because without full administrative rights, you're not going to be able to make this work. And again, you must have a location where the actual installation files are, and you'll need to have an authentication code, or else again, it is not going to work. You may decide that you want to install ArcMap, the desktop version, on the server. I typically do, because sometimes I want to go in on the server and make some modifications of a file or something and don't want to have to, okay, I got to jump out of the server and use desktop on my actual desktop machine, and then I got to jump back into the server. I just like to do some of the work right on the server. In the more recent iterations of ArcGIS Server and ArcGIS Desktop, it is much more easy, it is a lot easier to do things from the desktop on the server machine than it was a few versions ago. So just please be aware of that. Okay, you need to know, again, where are the installation files, and then you have to actually install the server, and that's what this first part is all about, is running the installation program to install the server. So, assuming that you found the installation files and you start executing the installation, and we've tried to be very careful that we didn't pre-think what was going on, so we took sort of a raw box there and decided to start from scratch because we wanted to make sure that you saw some of the same messages that we would normally see. If your box already had certain parameters set up for you, you might not see some of the messages, such as this one that is on the screen right now, which says it's got to have .NET 3.5, SP1, Service Pack 1 showing up here. This doesn't kill you on the installation process. It can be done later by using add and remove programs after the installation, but it's got to be done before you actually try to operate this server. So you might decide to break out of the installation at this point and go and make sure this is on the machine and also turned on as an operating service. So .3.5 in this version, SP1 is required. The next thing that comes up is you must specify an account. This should not be an account in which the password is changed and should not be your real domain account. This is an account just for the software that you're going to use. And so you must install a username. And you see here I've chosen ArcGIS. I choose other things for other machines. And then there's a place to put a password in, and you must confirm the password. You must, of course, meet the password criteria on things such as symbols, capital letters, things like that. So make sure you've met that. Record this, because this is not something that your instructor can see and do anything for you from the back end. Now, your instructor may ask that you send this to them just so they can be helpful to you in case you lose it yourself. But be aware you need to keep this and not lose it, or else it makes it much, much more difficult to get back into your box and to do anything with it. A configuration file is basically, if you went back through a new install of your software, it would give you the ability to just use this configuration file, and by using the configuration file, you'd be able to not have to answer all the questions that we're going to go through here. You can not export the configuration file. That's perfectly fine. That's the default. Or you might export the configuration file. But if you do, make sure you put it in a secure location, because it does contain information that you want to make sure it stays secure. The configuration file, as I've noted here, is just an XML file, which means you can actually open the configuration file in something like Notepad and take a look at it. After you've gone through those screens, you should see the software beginning to install for yourself. The time of the installation is going to take a varying amount. It all depends on what else is running on this server. And again, hopefully it's a fairly clean box with nothing much running on it. It also depends on the speed of your server, the speed of your remote connection, the amount of memory you have. All those will vary to how long it's going to take you to do the install. Once the software is fully installed, then you're going to need to put the authorization code in. The authorization code will need to be downloaded from Esri directly, and that's something that your instructor will have to do. It's not something you'll do and get the authorization code, but that will be provided to you, that we don't expect you to go out and actually get the authorization codes. So once you get through that process, it's going to ask you for the authorization code. And the authorization code is normally a file that you're going to need to go find. So what I typically do is I get this authorization file, I put that file on the desktop of the machine I'm working on, and then I browse to that authorization code. So that authorization code may have been put on your machine before you actually got to your machine, which is perfectly fine. But you will need to be able to get to the authorization code. It's going to ask you some questions as you're authorizing it. Here's the answers I gave: that I was an education staff faculty, I'm in higher education, and I'm an educator. Those are the types of selections that I made. There are different selections that you might make. This has nothing to do with how your software is going to authorize, but it's just a way for Esri to learn some more information about you. Notice this is a place we've asked you to take a screenshot. Then you're going to be asked, as your server sets up, you're going to be asked if you want to join an existing site or create a new site. You definitely want to create a new site because you want to be the only machine on that site. Machines can actually work together is what this is, joining an existing site. So we want you to create a new site because we want you to see what a single standalone box does and how it looks, and that's typically the way most people work anyway. So you're going to again create a primary site administrator account. This is going to be, could be the same as what you already created. I suggest to make it actually different. So this is your third set of usernames and passwords, one to log into the machine, one to get started, and then this username password situation as your site administrator account. Once you've got that done, you go through the next, and eventually you'll get to a point where you're going to click finish. And it's going to take several minutes probably after you do this to make sure it all happens. So making sure I can log on to my server is what this is about. And so I put in my credentials. Obviously you can see my password. I put in my credentials, and then I would click login, and I should be able to get onto the machine. Note in these slides, a lot of times we're going to use localhost. That just means I'm on that machine. I don't have to worry about the machine's IP address or anything like that, but I am actually physically on the machine. We're still in the installation process. We can see that it's actually done some installation here. We're actually in the Server Manager program, and you can see there is a default file that's already been created that's running, because it says one instance is running for us, and there can only be one instance here. So we're just looking at the manager part. Again, we want to prove that you have got that far, so notice we again have the camera icon there just to show us that you've reached this point. As we noted here, the server is now set up and operational, but it can only be used internal inside the organizational firewall, and the reason behind that is something called a web adapter. Right now, your ArcGIS server is working on port 6080. A lot of organizations block this port on your machine. Typically, when you go out on the internet, you're working out of port 80. And what the web adapter is going to do is going to take port 6080 and translate it into port 80 so you can actually get out on the internet. So just be aware that you need to run this web adapter. So even with the web adapter installed, your server may not be visible to the outside world. And why is that? It's because of the IP address. And this is an institutional decision, an instructor decision. You might be in private IP space. So therefore, anybody within your organization can see what you're doing. Other students in your class can see what you're doing. But you're not going to have a public-facing web server sitting there that anybody can ping and get into. I'm assuming they have the appropriate password. Most organizations do not give out lots of public IP addresses, so therefore your machine probably is going to be sitting behind the firewall. But again, that is up to your institution and your instructor on what happens there. So the next several slides is going to go through the actual installation of the web adapter. You should find that in your install files. And this is going to take you basically through setting up some things with IIS. Again, we're assuming you're running a Microsoft server, and you can see the components listed below with an X are missing. See, there's a whole bunch of components I'm missing. You might not be missing the same components. Again, it depends on how things were installed. And we're trying to give you an idea of what things are going to look like in what screens that you're going to see. You click I agree. And so one of the things you got to do is turn on, under the web adapter, you got to turn on the cross-domain policy file. And the X means it's not installed. You use the pull down here, and by using the pull down, you're going to see something that looks like this. And we want to use port 80 again, so that's the one I'm going to select. So we're going to make sure the web adapter using the right port. You got to configure the web adapter before it can be used. So we're going to select that we're going to use it with an ArcGIS server. We're not going to worry about what a portal is right now, but that we're going to use it with an ArcGIS server. Here's our IP address to one of my services, a public-facing server. So 216 is a public-facing address. It might have started with a different address if it is an internal address. I'm going to log in again with my username and password. Here, notice 6080 on the end. It's got a colon and then 6080, and the reason behind that is that's the port that was the default port when it was set up in installing the server part. And what now we're trying to do again is making the server able to be used with websites. So the process was successful, and so you can see here it gives me a complete pathway from my organization. Yours are going to look very, very different, but it gives me a complete pathway here, and the web adapter has been set up and is completely functional. So we've got a couple more slides here to make sure things are working. So now I've gone to a web browser. I've put in my IP address. You should have recorded yours back on a slide ago or so. You got to put in ArcGIS if you use the default, which is what we should use, REST, and then services. And so what we're going to do is look at where information is. There was one service, remember, already running that we saw that when we did our installation called Sample World Cities. And if we click on this, we should then see some information about the services. If we see information about the services, we pretty much are assured that our server is running properly. Notice there is nothing about 6080 here, and so therefore we should also assume that our web adapter is set up. is working pretty much correctly. So we're just going to test and see if we can actually see this predefined service that was part of your installation routine and make sure that we can get there. So the time for this installation is not short in general. It's going to take a while. When I did this installation to get and made these screen captures for this part of the lesson, it took me about 2 hours to do this. So don't be surprised if it takes a while and it sits there and you're not sure if it's working or not. Things. We made sure that we did it as what we think is sort of a blanket install. So there were some inherent errors that would occur for most installers, where it asks like fixing what's not running, the .NET 3.5 not being there, the framework, and so we tried to do that. Esri has lots of good information on installing servers, so that's where I would always go for first line troubleshooting. And again, each version of software has some uniquenesses about it, and so we used a 10.3 server install. There are newer versions than that, and there are older versions of that, so your screenshots may look a little different. In general, I found the newer the version of the software that we're using, the less work it took by me as the installer, and the easier and the more automatic it became. So we're going to stop the video at this point, and we'll create another video to go for the next section of this module. But this is the slides that you should use to install the operating system ArcGIS server.